So for our first illustrative painting, we have one of two choices. The first one is to document learning a skill or completing a process and then being able to illustrate it. So we're going to use watercolor for this one. So what I'd like you to do is to think about a task or a skill that you would like to complete. This could be maybe something that you took up during quarantine. So maybe you learned to do something like bake a cake. You tried maybe a new recipe. You learned how to play the kazoo. Maybe you learned how to fold the perfect paper airplane. And so, what you would want to do is get those supplies, and then you would want to complete the task. And while you're completing the task, you'd want to be taking some photos. So, one of the reasons why I'm showing this early is because you're going to need to take some time to do the actual process. So you'd want to get the ingredients or the supplies that you would need, and you'd want to experiment with different photos at different angles. I'll talk a little bit later about how to take really good photos. I'd like you to limit your reference images because I really would like these to be as personal as possible. So I'd like you to take your own photos for these. So then you would document the different parts of it, any practice that you might have done in order to perfect this skill, and you'd want to document that as well. You complete the task, right? And obviously, if you try something messy, make sure that you clean up after yourself so the parents don't kill you or me. And then what you'd want to do is look over your photos and decides which ones are used. And then you would compose and sketch your composition. So I have some examples. Looks like I'm missing an example here. Sorry. Here's some examples of some artworks made by other students and other examples I found online. So you can see that you could illustrate the entire process through words, through imagery, through organization in order to do this one. So this one is learn a skill. The other possibility that you could do is inspired by an artist named Danny Gregory. And so for this artwork, he has a series, he has a video that he also makes as well. You can watch this video. We're not going to do it right now. We'll watch it in class later. And he has it in his blog. And he does this supposedly every morning. He documents his breakfast. So he'll tell a story and he will often do it directly in his sketchbook. Now, we will draw ours out instead and take reference photos. But what you're going to want to do is to think about a meal. So for your meal, it doesn't have to be breakfast. It could be any meal or snack, but you want to make sure that it's interesting. So maybe you want to pick a favorite meal, or maybe you want to pick one that you dislike and you don't like, because then you could illustrate how much you don't like it. You could think about how a meal could represent a special occasion, a particular person, like a family member, or maybe even your cultural background. You might want to include ingredients to this favorite meal and think about how it could represent you, right? So here's just some inspiration to give you. Once again, we're going to want to take our own photos, but you really want to think about imagery of the meal. So these plate and bowl imagery are much better. We don't want to have like this kind of clip arty images of favorite foods, but maybe that gives you inspiration, right? You can think about some of your favorite foods and how you could document these. So when you are thinking for the next week and documenting these special meals that you might be having, one of the things you'll want to do is make sure that you take good photos. So this applies to both prompts. When you are taking good pictures, please make sure to set up an area to take the photos. This might not be the best time to take photos is during like the family meal. You might have to move things from the family meal to take better pictures. You might want to get rid of distracting imagery, maybe even use sort of a neutral background or a tabletop. You would want to make sure that you have proper lighting. You wouldn't want it to be dark in the room. Um, if you could do it during the day, that would be awesome. So near a window in daytime is best. You could use a lamp or an overhead light, but you want to experiment with the angle. So on the side of this, I have an example of natural light at the very bottom. So a nice large window, and then setting up your food on this tabletop or this desk would be probably the best kind of light. Maybe having some sort of clamp light or arch light that you can angle and experiment with how that light changes the imagery depending on how high and low and from what direction it comes from. You could really play with shadows if you wanted to. And then, of course, besides just proper lighting and distracting imagery, you'd also want to make sure that your image is in focus, doesn't have a lot of hot spots. What I mean by hot spots is that it's not too bright so that you lose details, and you wouldn't want to have a lot of shadows that you couldn't see details in either. And so when you are taking photos, please make sure that you're composing using your viewfinders. You want to make sure that the focal point is not directly placed in the center, thinking about using the rule of thirds, trying to fill in the space to get rid of empty space. You don't want a lot of distracting background. You want to try to take your pictures from different viewpoints. I have a resource here for you to click on. I have a resource here for thinking about how to take pictures from different angles and also different arrangements. So you can reorganize your imagery as many times as you need to get some different compositions. So think about different placement of the food, overlapping imagery to create space, and trying even close-ups. So I put some examples here about thinking how to compose. Here we have our rule of thirds. This is that grid that often pops up on your phone when you're taking pictures. Notice that this big bowl of food is in one of these bisecting line segments. That's how you use the rule of thirds, right? And then you can have secondary imagery also lining up, like the soy sauce here. Think about arranging your plates and bowls and silverware using diagonals, right? That creates a sense of movement. How can you create space? Maybe you're doing a close-up like these pancakes and get rid of distracting imagery. Notice how it's not centered, right? And then also having a sense of overlap. These two on the top are like top shots, but this one here is a side. So notice how things get smaller and fuzzier as they go back into space, right? Here's an example of different viewpoints. So here the camera's high, here it's still a little bit high, and here it's straight on. So really move yourself around your imagery as you're taking your photos. So what you want to do is take at least 10 pictures and save them in a Google folder that you will make shareable. We'll also put a link to this Google folder in our process portfolio. So this assignment for how to take photos is going to be for both of the prompts, the breakfast pages or the learning of a skill.